Namaste. Welcome to Atharva Forum, where I have the pleasure of interacting with Professor Jagtap, who was formerly heading the chemical research group in Bhabha Atomic Research Center at Bombay, from where he superannuated, and currently he is a distinguished professor at IIT Bombay. Let us begin this conversation by looking at the past contributions, like say, what are some of the highlights in the contribution towards chemistry by our ancient Indians during the ancient pre-Vedic period in our history? Professor Jagtap.
Thank you, Professor Ramanathan. Let's begin with a bird's eye view of the development of chemical sciences in India. As we all know, that India has a glorious tradition of chemistry and metallurgy spanning over about 3,000 years or more. And this history is understood in terms of 5 distinct periods, which we always talk about. The first period is the Vedic period, that is up to 600 BCE. In this period, the basic issues related to the medicinal chemistry and metallurgical chemistry started. Then we have a period of 600 BCE to 800 CE, which belongs to the Ayurvedic period. Then we have a transitional period, 800 CE to 1100 CE, where the metallic oxides and metallic compounds were introduced in the medical system. And then from 1100 CE to 1300 CE, we have a very curious period, which is called the Tantric period, where chemistry was mixed up with the worship of Shiva and Parvati in the Tantric cult. A lot of chemistry was done during this period. And then comes the era, the period of iatrochemical period from 1300 CE to 1550, this middle of 16th century, where much of this knowledge which was discovered during the Tantric period was utilized for public good. Now, if I may just make a statement that in these periods, in 3,000 years of history, the Indians had achieved a remarkable progress in material science and metallurgy, which included atomistic basis of chemistry, extraction, preparation, purification, characterization, and applications of metals, alloys, and chemical compounds, and also the chemical processes which we today know as calcination, sublimation, distillation, steaming, fixation, casting, etc. Not for laboratory scale, but for the large scale. And most important thing to remember is that in all these endeavors, the Indian chemists were far ahead of their counterparts elsewhere in the world. Now, if I may add here that the Indian chemistry and metallurgy has several milestones. I'll narrate few of them. From 2500 to 1800 BC, we have the chemistry and metallurgy of gold, silver, copper, lead, also the gold, silver alloys, the minerals, glazed potteries, art of dyeing in that period, and also the copper mines and lost wax casting. From 1500 to 1800 BCE, we have copper smelting, iron technology, extraction of tin, making of glass, fermentation, tanning, and also the medicinal chemistry. 600 to 400 BCE, we have the evidences for brass, steel, colored glasses, ink, amalgams, vegetable dyes, and it was accompanied by the atomic theory and concepts of compound formation. One historical evidence is in 400 BC, the King Puru presented Indian steel to Alexander. The Indian steel by that time had that reputation that King Puru did not give gold or silver to Alexander, but it was Indian steel. 100 to 400 CE, we have ideas about the chemical combinations, preparation of alkalis, use of minerals in medicine, relation between heat and chemical change. 370 to 375, we have one more historical evidence where the iron pillar, that's the pure wrought iron, which was fabricated at Mathura, and then it was shifted to Delhi in 1050 CE. 400 to 600 CE, we have the technology of pure copper, processes for hardening of steel, arsenic came into the picture, and the cosmetic preparations. 500 CE is that famous statue of Gautam Buddha, 7 feet 6 inches tall. It's a pure copper, 99.7% copper, weighing about a ton. So that sort of a copper technology was practiced in India. 600 CE, the wood steel for making high quality swords, Indians began to export it to Damascus and Syria for making those famous Damascus swords. 800 to 900 CE, the extraction of zinc from calamine, use of mercuric sulfide in medicine, and advanced knowledge of gemstones. By 1000 CE, Indians started making paper. In fact, Indians used to export paper. 1100 to 1200 CE, soap, indelible ink, sulfuric acid, antimony from stibnite, classification of chemicals, and laboratory practices were formalized. And 1300 to 1600 CE, lots of chemistry was used for several applications like medical use of calomel, blended perfumes, aqua regia, very exotic alloys, copper, lead, zinc, and tin. I will just take two examples. While we talk about all these achievements took long. And we must know whatever the different things, different ideas which were in vogue that time. The first example which I take is a wood steel. The wood steel is a special steel. It is steel containing 1 to 1.6% carbon. And this material was indeed an advanced material of the ancient world. This process originated in South India, sometime 500 BC. We have the writings of Greek physician Stasia on this process. And also we have the carbon dating of the crucibles. By 200 BC, this process was adopted in Sri Lanka. And then comes the glorious period for the wood steel, that is 600 to 1700 AD. This was exported to Arab world and Europe. And it has been gloriously mentioned by several Arab scholars like Hamza, 600 AD, Jabir ibn Hayar, 800 AD, Al-Biruni, 1100 AD, and Arab Idrisi in 1200 AD. From 1700 onwards, the Westerners started taking interest in wood steel. Benjamin Hans, the German botanist, was visiting South India. He located the place where the wood steel was manufactured. That was in 1800. And he named it as woods. And that word is derived from the South Indian word wukku. And immediately the samples of this wood steel were sent to the Royal Society of Chemistry for analysis of composition. And one of the greatest chemists, Michael Faraday, he attempted to produce wood steel, but he failed. We know that the wood steel, or the swords made out of it, the Damascus swords, they show a wavy pattern on the surface. And therefore, this Damascus swords and the woods, they were the primary motivation for studying microstructures when the microscopes came in the metallurgical sciences. And it is said that the metallurgy, microstructures, metallurgical sciences in UK, France, Russia, and United States, they grew out of this material to understand what are those wavy patterns. And then in the 20th century, the woods was made using modern technology. What Indians had achieved 500 BC. So this you can see that is a material invented in India, and it went to the world and contributed to the progress of steel. Another interesting example is the history of zinc. This originated sometime in 700 BC. The zinc ore mining up to 263 meter depth was achieved. This is an archaeological evidence. Kautilya's Arthashastra talks about it, and that's dated 200 BC. From 400 BC to 100 AD, several brass objects have been found in Takshashila and Gangetic Plain, which contain brass greater than 33% of zinc. And that's very important. Making brass, there are two processes. One is the cementation process. In the cementation process, you don't extract zinc from the zinc ore, but heat copper along with the zinc, so that the zinc which is formed gets into the hot copper and you form brass. But the percentage of brass cannot exceed the percentage of zinc in the calamine. That's the zinc ore. So you need to repeat it 2 times, 3 times, but ultimately you cannot expect more than 20-25% of zinc in the brass, and therefore that brass is considered to be low quality. On the other hand, these brass objects which were found in Takshashila, they have greater than 33% of zinc, and this is the evidence for metallic zinc. 100 to 200 BC, the Buddhism introduced brass in China. 500 to 1200 AD, we have several brass images of Buddha. In fact, there was also a brass stupa, and also the brass images of deities of Hindus and Jains. And Yuan Sang, who visited during this period, also talks about it. 700 to 800 AD, Nagarjuna documented method for zinc extraction. And you can see that documentary evidence came much later. The technology or the science was practiced much before the documentation. And then comes the next period of zinc metallurgy. In 800 AD, the industrial scale production started at Zawar in Rajasthan. There are archaeological evidences for this. And this industrial scale production was expanded during 1100 to 1200 AD. That is at Zawar, Rajasthan. The 1200 AD, the zinc extraction is reported in Rasaratna Samuchaya. So you can see that the documentary evidences is much later than the actual practice of extracting zinc from calamine. 1400 AD, in Bidar, originated the Bidri art, which is based on 76 to 98% zinc. However, this zinc is different from Zawar, as we know from the isotopic analysis, in particular, the lead isotopes. In 16th century, Portuguese took Indian zinc technology to China. And most likely, they took it from South India, because China exported zinc to Europe under the name Totamo or Tutenar, which is derived from Tathanaga for zinc in South India. And then comes 1740, when William Champion established zinc smelting at Bristol. And his process of downward distillation process is a copy of the Zawar zinc technology. In fact, it is said that William Champion applied for a patent, which was rejected, but later on he was given this. So this is an example, I would say, in today's language, was a technology transfer to UK by India. That happened through the zinc technology. So you can see that there are several examples like this: the copper technology, making of calomel. You can create the whole picture. It's so fascinating that in that period, our ancestors could achieve so much.
That's a wonderful survey, in a very brief nutshell, as you had introduced. It's an overview of the various contributions that we have had at different points of time in our history, right from a very pre-Vedic age until the 1800, when William Champ tried to even patent in vain, perhaps. So talking of these kind of interesting contributions, I just wish to add that when the zinc metallurgy was being discussed or being researched by, there is a report by Craddock, Gurjar and Hegde.
Yes.
And they go by this fact that the many hundreds of thousands of tons of debris suggest the production of many tens of thousands of tons of zinc. So
yeah, that's about yeah, they estimated about 1 lakh tons of zinc extracted in 5 centuries. Yes.
So this itself can give us a sense of the scale of proportion with which the zinc metallurgy or zinc refining process was taken so seriously in our country. And as you had also mentioned about the copper statue of Buddha, standing statue, it's indeed a very lofty one. It was excavated from a place called Sultanganj in Bihar.
Yes.
But unfortunately today, that statue is not in our possession. And it is standing as a museum artifact in Birmingham in United Kingdom.
Yes.
Again, this is a good survey that we have had. Now, if I may say so, that between both of us, we belong to perhaps two different generations in terms of our age. So at least for myself, I can vouch for it that such kind of contributions were never taught to us in the scholastic framework, in the school textbooks. Was it also similar when you were in the school? What was the scenario? I would like to know about this.
Yes, you are absolutely right that these things were not taught to us in the schools. But I can explain it in somewhat different way. See, while we belong to two different generations, there is one thing common to both of us, that we were born and brought up after independence. And therefore, we need to think in terms of our education before independence and after independence. The before independence, we know the English Education Act of 1835 introduced formal education in this country. And what was the background for this? And this was said by the Charles Grant, one of the directors of the British East India Company. And what he said was, once English knowledge was imparted to the Asiatics, their faculty of reasoning would be restored and they would rise to the scale of human beings. So the entire purpose of English education was to make us civilized. And how to make us civilized? To the English language, English history, and all the English sciences that England was proud of. Then came the Wood's Dispatch 1854 and the Indian Universities Act in 1857. And we had the three universities, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. But again, the education was entirely with the imperial interest. The British also started medical colleges and engineering colleges. But engineering colleges were primarily to generate those sub-assistant engineers who would help British European engineers in the works. So the entire purpose of the education, as it was said, was to produce a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in test, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. And in this scenario, there was no place for Indian knowledge. Well, there were people who objected to this. They wanted some Indianness to the education. One example I can give you, Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, he presented to the Hunter Commission in 1882, and what he said is that this sort of education, what you are imparting is no good for us. You include agriculture, you include technical education, you include some local arts in the education. See, this is what was the demand of the locals. However, this was not taken up. And then next time this particular issue came up in 1937. India was about to be independent, and there was a Zakir Hussain committee which was constituted. This was by Congress, to see what sort of education can be imparted in free India. And this committee came up with interesting suggestions. They said that in the primary schools, out of 5 hours and 30 minutes, the basic craft education should be 3 hours and 20 minutes. And all these Indian crafts, see, once you introduce the crafts in the education, at a later stage, one can introduce the science behind it. However, this particular report was not taken into account. See, the situation after independence was somewhat different. We must recognize that India gained its freedom on the backdrop of many things in science and technology, which were happening at that time. For example, there was a remarkable development of science and technology in the World War II period. There is a famous statement that the scientists won the Second World War with the microwave radar and ended it with the nuclear bomb. And this microwave radar gave rise to the communication technologies, ended up in masers and lasers. The nuclear bomb, it ended up in the nuclear energy programs. So that was the backdrop when India gained the freedom. Also important to note that United States, which was largely an agricultural country in the 19th century, it became a world power, economic and military power, starting from the beginning of the 20th century, largely because of this modern science and technology. Another thing which we largely forget is that the Second World War was followed by the Cold War. And the Cold War, we know all about it, but it was a technological race for the military supremacy, and it involved Sputnik, the space research, high energy accelerators, high potent nuclear weapons. There is a terminology which is used for the science development in this time, which is the Cold War and the hot physics. Now you see, we gained independence in this period. This was a fast-paced action in science and technology, and therefore there was no place for the traditional Indian science. So you're absolutely right that right from 1835, when the formal education started in this country, until very recently, we never thought in terms of our traditional Indian science, because the aims were different, the backdrop was different. You can ask this question that why are we thinking about it now? Well, the Indian science started gaining attention when the world started facing the ill effects like the climate crisis. And this is an important issue. And this issue has been brought forth by the Western thinkers and philosophers. In fact, we should have been doing it, but they started promoting this. I was reading some time ago a very interesting article by Jeanine Gespin-Michel of the University of Rouen. The article's name is What Science for What Democracy, published in 2012. And what he writes there, I quote him, modern Western science developed around the idea of mastering nature. Other forms of knowledge of those called native peoples, for example, are based on another view of the world that includes humanity in nature. Does the idea of mastering nature necessarily lead to the science we know? It's a very important question that was raised. And this is around that there is an alternate form of science which can be developed, which has that humanity in nature. Will it end up in the same science, same end results? Now, this does not look very awkward to us because we know we take the Indian sciences. Let's take chemistry and metallurgy. The way our ancestors did the metallurgy and chemistry, created the alloys, all that was in harmony with the nature. And today, science, the Western science, modern Western science, with that also we can test whether they were doing it right or wrong. So finally, you end up with the same result. However, you retain that humanity in nature as the prime component. And that's the hallmark of Indian science and technology. And this view is now percolating in Indian science, Indian scientists. And therefore, we now talk about our ancient heritage. How did they do it? Can we practice some of those things? Can we do it? This is an alternate way of looking at the science development. So we are at the right time today to think about this and educate our younger generation on these issues.
You're indeed right to say that compare the kind of education scenario before and after the independence. But what still baffles me is that once we are independent, and it's only the recent past that we have been started to look at our ancient contribution and the heritage, Indian heritage in science. But which should have, in my opinion, it should have got immediately done once we were free and once we were having a free hand to draft our own education programs, where even at least a glimpse of what our past achievements were, had it been told, if not in science or in some other subject, I think we would have gained larger benefits in the past. That's
yes, that would have made our younger generation aware of the scientific heritage of this country. Surely.
That's true. Continuing further, like we know a subject of history. As such, history is riddled with a lot of biases, despite because it's not objective science. It's not like science, where the data speaks for itself. It is a subject which is riddled with a lot of bias and high degree of subjectivities. Now, we also get to see a similar thing in history of science and particularly in history of chemistry when it concerns India. What are your opinions on this, and how do you think this affects our knowledge of our past? That is the historiography of our past contribution. Over to you.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that requires a very elaborate answer. The biases and the subjectiveness, what we are talking about, have various dimensions. And the first we know about is the difficulty in chronology. I mean, this we often say that Nagarjuna whether he existed in 200 AD or 800 AD. But that's the typical hallmark of India, I must say here, that we are not very kind to our history. We don't record our history properly. And why talk about 200 AD and 800 AD? I'll give you a simple example. When the corona pandemic started in this country, the education sector was affected. And then somebody said, our three old universities, the Calcutta University, Mumbai University, and Madras University, they have seen two pandemics earlier. 1895, the plague pandemic, and 1920, the Spanish flu. So it was conjectured that their records would have some guidelines how to go ahead in this pandemic. However, there is no record available with our universities what they did in 1895 or 1920. This is just about 100 years ago. This is what is happening to our own. This is our sense of history, that we don't respect our history. And also this chronology is riddled by several fake copper plates and all that. We know about it. The recent example is the Sabarimala copper plates. They happen to be fake. So that poses lots of difficulties in chronology of this. The second one is about the lateral extrapolation and claims and lateral interpretations and claims, which also creates lots of confusion. See, when I was talking to the experts in a meeting, I said that, look, what we need to do is to use the principle of scientific skepticism and sort out things. Now, scientific skepticism is an epistemological position in which you question the veracity of a claim lacking empirical evidence. So you ask for an empirical evidence, and if you get satisfied, you say that this thing could be correct. And therefore, this way you can test the beliefs for reliability by subjecting them to systematic investigation and discover some empirical evidence. So if you can do that, then we can remove many of the doubts. I'll just cite one example. And this is, the first example is Acharya Praful Chandra Ray in the History of Hindu Chemistry, Volume 1, page 93. He starts talking about the gun. And then he says that ancient Hindus are sometimes credited with knowledge of the art of manufacturing gunpowder, in support of which the several recipes given in Shukraniti, or the elements of quality of Shukracharya, which we have already had occasions to quote, are cited. Take for example, and he quotes what Shukraniti says about this gunpowder. And then he concludes, from the circumstantial details given above, he gives the procedure as it is given in Shukraniti, especially of the method of preparing the charcoal, one is naturally led to suspect that the lines relating to gunpowder, as quoted above, are later interpolations. The suspicion is further enhanced when it is borne in mind that in the polity of Kamandaki, an ancient work of undoubted authenticity, there occurs no reference whatever to the firearms, nor is there in the Agni Purana, in which the subject of training in the use of arms and armory takes up 4 chapters, archery forming the leading element. The more rational conclusion would be that the Shukraniti is a patchwork in which the portions of chapter 4 were added sometime after the introduction of the gunpowder in Indian warfare during Muslim period. So what he tries to do, he tries to establish that correlation and says that this probably is not the right description. The right description could be something else. So this is what has happened in many texts. We have this problem of interpolation at a later date. There is another other part of the story is lateral interpretations and claims. See, when in my graduation, when I was learning quantum physics, we had the Sakurai's book, Advanced Quantum Physics and Quantum Mechanics. And Sakurai would write that after this quantization of electromagnetic field, you get three operators: the creation operator, the number operator, and annihilation operator. And then he relates it to the Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. The Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the number operator, and the Mahesh, he destroys. It's a correlation. There is no substantial evidence that you have that the quantization of electromagnetic field was ever done in the ancient times. There are several such stories which go around. Many of them are unsubstantiated. They are using certain interpretations and then make claims. I will not go into the stories of those various interpretations, but I was fascinated by the story of Kakudni. Let me just narrate you this small story which comes in the Vishnu Purana. This Kakudmi has a beautiful daughter, Revati, and Kakudmi wants to marry her to the most eligible bachelor on the earth. And since he could not find, he thought of going to Brahma and ask him for the his idea. So he travels all the way to Brahma. And when he is on the doorstep, he was asked to wait for some time until Brahma finishes listening to the music and all that. And then he enters. And Brahma asked him, so what is your problem? He said, look, this is the problem that I have. I want to get the most eligible bachelor for marrying my daughter. And then Brahma laughs and says that, look, by the time you have come here, by the time you have stayed at the doorstep, 27 yugas have passed, something like that. 27 Chatur yugas have passed. And by the time you go back, next 27 Chatur yugas will pass. And therefore, there won't be anybody of your generation or your daughter's generation existing on the earth that time. But you can do one thing. By the time you reach earth, the Lord Shiva would take incarnation as Krishna, and his elder brother Balarama. He is the right match for your daughter. So you go back, find out Balarama, and marry your daughter. And there is also a very interesting part of that story. It says that when they met Balarama, Revati was much taller than Balarama because she was born in a different yugas. So the Balarama has his plow. He presses the plow on her shoulders and makes her short. And then he marries. Now, this particular story looks like a story of time dilation. If you travel at the speed of light, then the time will dilate. The time will not pass for you, but for those in the rest frame, the time would be flowing as it is. Well, this is a story. There is a correlation that exists with what time dilation will say, but this is not this does not say that we knew about the theory of relativity and all that, because then we need to take up the side issues, if there was, suppose, argument said theory of relativity, then there should be a discussion on tensors. Was the tensor algebra developed that time? And you can see the type of mathematics that was developed was not at par with what is required for theory of relativity. So the human imaginations, you can see the beautiful imagination. But from this, you cannot do the lateral interpretation and claim something. And this is where the scientific skepticism comes into the picture, that every reader, every listener, everybody should use that and ask these questions. Now, you ask this question that, well, how do these claims, these narratives, they affect us? They affect us a lot. In fact, all these biases, all these wrong narratives, they are a big hurdle in promoting our genuine achievements. In that time period, we had really achieved something great. We don't need all these stories. See, for example, if Europeans knew about zinc smelting in 1740 and Indians had done it 500 BC, that itself speaks of the kind of development we had in this country. And therefore, this becomes extremely important. See, when I go and give talks on ancient Indian chemistry, there is invariably I get a question that the ancient Indians knew how to convert mercury into gold. And then you ask, where is that proof? You show me. Nobody has, but this is the kind of this kind of things are propagated. There is one extremely important thing that we all Indians should worry about. Claiming everything that is discovered today or yesterday, saying that it was discovered in India long, long ago, gives a wrong picture about we as people. The Indians are derived as a group of people who look in the past glory to psychologically mitigate their shortcomings in the present. This is the statement people make. The wise people make this statement. And I don't think we should be really looking for such glories. We have enough knowledge. We have enough skills in this country that we developed over the last 3,000 years. We don't need this. And since this is all quoted in various books, I mean, I should not see, there is a beautiful book by Ellen Churchill Semple, The Influences of Geographic Environment. And what he quotes there is pretty interesting. From the dawn of history, the northern Indian Ocean was a thoroughfare. Along this thoroughfare, Indian colonists, mind this word, Indian colonists, traders and priests carried the elements of Indian civilization to the easternmost Sunda Island, that's in Indonesia, and Oriental where sciences and religions moved westward to the margin of Europe and Africa. So the science development, the development of the civilization across all these places where we could touch is credited to the Indians. And then this particular book says the Hindus became the dominant commercial nation of the Indian Ocean long before the great development of Arabian Sea, and later shared the trade of the East African coast with the merchants of Oman. Lots of things were happening. We had achieved really something great for that period. So why do we claim? If we are feeling somewhat, there is a statement which is made that, are we wounded that after the British ascent in India, we lost out and therefore we want to do it? Well, if you want to regain that position, what is described just now, then we need to work hard. We need to do something. and then we can achieve that past. This past glory cannot be achieved by interpreting, reinterpreting literally, or doing like this. And this is my sincere concern that we should not be doing it. We have enough to show, and therefore we don't need to take recourse to this set of biases, interpretations, misinterpretations. This is what I have to say.
That's very well put. And if I may kind of summarize or paraphrase it, we get stuck between two opinions, which are the distant end of a spectrum, where one says India's contribution to science is only zero. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who even claim that even Higgs boson was there in our past scriptures.
Yes.
So somewhere we need to strike the balance. And as you said, we need to see through the scientific facts and present them, because they themselves stand by to represent our glory, our heritage. And we don't have to resort to any other interpolations or literal interpretations in order to establish our past glory. So that's well put.
Absolutely right.
Now, moving ahead, you briefly touched upon this question in your past deliberation, that why are we looking at the past glory now? But then in connection to that, let me ask another question, that with all these past glorious achievements in this field, where are we in the present? This one question that looms large is that why are we not continuing the past legacy? Say for instance, I know that we are in the science and technology. I know that the science and technology has advanced tremendously in the last 100 years. And you also talked about this Cold War and the Hot War period, where Second World War gave birth to a lot of new scientific technological advancements. With all these new inventions and discoveries, one need not stick to the past just for the heck of it. But say in other fields, like even producing the rustless iron, which is still in high demand, say in sectors like railways, why are we not in a position to recreate what our forefathers did, say a millennium ago? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good that you raised that point of rustless iron. The Indians had really mastered the iron technology. And I would narrate a couple of incidences on this particular thing. The first one is what is not known to many people. This is what I have got it from the magazine Nature. And this is 1882, July 13, 1882 issue of Nature. Very well respected scientific journal. They wrote an article on the achievement of Valentin Ball. The Valentin Ball was the superintendent of Geological Survey of India, and he wrote a book, Economic Geology of India, very interesting book. And I think anybody who is interested in Indian chemistry, metallurgy should read that book. That book was published in 1881. On that, there is a comment, and I'll read out something pertinent to our present discussion. What it says is, even in quite recent days, this is 1882, even in quite recent days, Indian steel was considerable demand in England. Okay. And then it says that it is generally not known that a large quantity of the excellent iron used in the construction of Menai suspension and Britannica tubular bridges was from Porto Novo works in South Arcot in Salem district. Now this Menai suspension, it was built in 1818. The Britannica tubular bridge started construction in 1846. This length is 460 meters. So for these bridges and the suspension, the steel from South India was imported. And this is quoted by Nature. This Porto Novo what is quoted in this particular article is, I was looking for the place. This is the Parangipettai in Kadlur. So the Indian steel, the technology, was practiced at least up to 1846. From this reference, we know this. And then we lost it for some reasons. We'll discuss that at a later stage. So the Indian steel was a high quality steel. The second instance is my own personal experience. So somewhere around 2006, 2007, I and my team, we were discussing with French Atomic Energy, the scientists from that place. And during the discussion, that French scientist said that they had conducted one project in India with some universities of South India in collaboration. And the title of that project was why the steel used in ancient Indian temples is rustless. So we were curious. So the first question that came from one of my colleagues is, why do you work on such area? And then the answer was very apt. The answer was that when you have the nuclear power, you will be faced with the problems of nuclear waste. The nuclear waste has to be stored for at least 300 years. And for storing, you need a container which will not rust. The iron which is used in your temples has not rusted for 1,000 years. So is that not the right material for storing nuclear waste? Now, you see, you are asking the question about the railways. Now, this is another dimension to the use of Indian steel using ancient technology. So you could use it for bridges, you could use it for storing nuclear waste. Now, this is where we have a problem. Now, to connect why we don't do it, let me just sensitize the audience on one particular issue, that is the Damascus swords, which were made of the Indian wood steel. They were found to contain large amounts of carbon nanotubes. This is not that the Indians knew about the carbon nanotubes. It happened that the way they processed it, the carbon nanotubes were formed. On this, Robert Curl, the Nobel laureate 1993, made a very interesting statement. Carbon nanotechnology was much older than the carbon nanoscience. For the Damascus sword, Indians produced the raw material, mined iron ore, and exported it. Up to the middle of 18th century, now you see the dates match. Middle of 18th century, the steel swords depended on this particular material, and when the mines in India stopped, they lost the technology. Why the mining in India stopped? Well, the mines came under the British regulations. Earlier to that, the people just could go mine and pay some taxes to the king. However, after British ascent, these mines were regulated. And once the mining was stopped, the Indians stopped producing this iron and they lost the technology. Now, these words are extremely important. That when it comes to technology, we need to think not only of knowledge, but also the skills. The knowledge remains in the books, it remains in the manuscripts, but the skills are with the practicing people. And once they stop practicing, the skills are lost, and therefore the technology is lost. See, the technology is, while we say in the science is a systematically organized study of knowledge, in contrast, technology relies on explicit and implicit knowledge. This is an important thing. This is an implicit knowledge. And this implicit knowledge is passed on by one-to-one interaction and is learned to the practical hands-on experience. And if you lose that skill for 150 years, you have essentially lost the technology. So it's like saying that you have a leading aircraft manufacturing company. They don't produce for 50 years, 100 years, they will lose the technology. And this is exactly what has happened in India, that we have the knowledge, but the skills based on which this technology can be taken forward are lost. And therefore, what we need to do today, this is not only in respect of the iron technology, but we have to keep track of many things which we have lost during this British period, the skills basically. We need to recreate those skills. How do we do that? That's the big question. Now, in case of iron technology, well, some rudimentary skills do exist today. There is a tribe called Asur in Jharkhand. They are the ancient iron smelters. And the iron smelted by them also has anti-rust. So whatever skills which are left out, we need to work on them and create that technology back. This is the challenge that we have. So we have the enough information, but that information is not enough. We need to create these skills.
Nicely put, Professor Jagtap. If only we had woken up a little earlier, we would have perhaps advanced. That's just my conjecturing here. But we are right now in the stage of really rediscovering our past glory. But having even rediscovered that, it will not make any sense if we do not advance further. Because both science and technology needs the society to take the knowledge and make it to higher advanced level. But right now we are at least the consolidation stage to know what is the past achievement. So moving ahead in that same direction, I know that you're heading one of the national level committees whose mandate is to bring out the authenticated ancient knowledge for its wider dissemination in the society, so that the coming generations of our next young children are at least made aware of their forefathers' contribution in a much organized manner. Now, be that as it may, on one hand, I'm curious to know whether our past knowledge, particularly in chemistry, is it only worth like a museum material to be exhibited now? Or you see any scope in advancing those past knowledge using the contemporary research methods? So your thoughts, and kindly elaborate with few examples if it's possible.
Yeah, good that you reminded me of that committee for communicating scientifically validated traditional Indian knowledge to the society. It's an important activity. Primarily, we know that there is lots of material which appears, which is unsubstantiated. And therefore, the younger generation or people at large should know what is scientifically validated Indian knowledge. While this is the primary view, there are also many other issues involved in this. The one issue is create that confidence in our society. When Acharya Praful Chandra Ray wrote those 2 volumes, History of Hindu Chemistry, in the preface, somewhere he writes that if the perusal of these pages will have the effect of stimulating my countrymen to strive to regain their old position in the intellectual hierarchy of nations. You see, this is what he thought, that the next generation would pick up something from this, will have the confidence that, yes, we were doing science, we were doing technology, and with that confidence, if they go ahead, they can probably regain that old position in the intellectual hierarchy of nation. Professor Kothari also wrote something. He said, how can we lament the lack of national pride in Indians without first acquainting them with the country's phenomenal scientific achievements in the dim distance past? So this efforts, what we are trying to do is to consolidate and make the younger generation aware. There is another issue which I have been particularly worried about. This is my interpretation. We Indians possess technological inferiority complex. See, anything which is manufactured abroad is something which is, whether it is China or anywhere, we just say it must be of a better quality than the Indian. In fact, the Indian manufacturers also start with that premise. This is what I call as a technological inferiority complex. I'll just give you one example here. This Fukushima disaster happened in 2011. And I was visiting one of the great Indian institute around that time. And then in the tea table, I sat for a discussion. And one very senior professor, he told me that if Japanese cannot handle this sort of a nuclear disaster, well, how do you say the Indians can handle it? This is again an technologically inferior. If they cannot do it, we certainly will not be able to do it. So this is that inferiority complex is across the country. And to my mind, this is because the history of science and technology does not exist. If you provide the historical perspective of the Indian journey of science and technology, make people aware of Indian achievements, then we can regenerate that confidence in the people, in the researchers, in the users, that we were doing technology in the past, we are doing it at present, and we will continue to do it. This is one way of removing that technological inferiority complex. Since you are talking about that committee, I must also add here that, see, when it comes to ancient Indian knowledge, our narrative is very limited. We will talk about philosophy, logic, ethics, literature, linguistics, mathematics, astronomy, Ayurveda and medical sciences, metallurgy and metallurgical chemistry. Certainly, these are long and continuous part of the long and continuous tradition of great scholarship that this country had. However, we never discuss one aspect, that in the dim distant past, we were a rich country. We were the workshop of the world. We rarely talk about this. And therefore, we need to discuss this and identify the reasons why we were rich at that time and identify the reasons why we are poor today. See, history is not only recounting the achievements of the past. History is the study of the present in the light of the past. And that light of the past has to be provided to the people that, look, this is what we were. This whole exercise is not only for chemistry, maths, or linguistics, astronomy, but also for something like this, that just to ask the question, why India was materially prosperous those years? Well, we had ingenious techniques, we had superlative skills, we were good at shipbuilding. The Cholas used to build ships of 75 tons, weighing 75 tons. We have not told our younger generation. And we were expert in seafaring. This all together brought that material prosperity to this country. This has to be told, and in the modern time, in today's time, we need to tell our students this. See, the Max Weber, the German economist, he had said once that the skill of Indians in the production of delicately woven fabric, in the mixing of colors, the working of metals and precious stones, the preparation of essences, and in all manners of technical art, has from very times enjoyed a worldwide celebration. Now, this is what foreigners say. What do we say? What do we tell our students? Now, last week I was talking to students in Chennai, and you ask a question. Well, India was rich. Do you know what we were exporting? You get answer, we were exporting spices. Exporting spices is a colonial narration. That is to show that you were by and large an agricultural country. And this is taught in our schools and everybody believes it. Then I said, look, India used to export processed goods, fine quality cotton fabric, silk, steel, metals, metalworks, jewelry, craft, dye stuff, glass beads, paper, cosmetics, perfumes, and even they used to export sugar lumps, processed. And all these years until about 16th century, the trade balance was largely in favor of India. And this is said, Pliny the Elder in the 1st century, he says that India is a heavy drain of gold from Rome. Even in Portugal in the 16th century, lamented that all the silver that we get from our colonies in South America, we are losing it to India. India was for many centuries the final depository of a large portion of the gold of the world. And that is why we have that obsession for gold, our temples have gold and all that is because of this. Why don't we tell our students, younger generation, we were rich? And that richness, see, Angus Madison, he made the analysis of the world GDP, and he shows that until 1700, India was contributing more than 25% to the world GDP. Why don't we talk about it? And this is what needs to be taken to the young generation. I'll just tell you that in the same breath that I'm talking about, when we discuss the chemistry, metallurgy, chemical sciences, we don't include weaving industry into it, which India was famous for. See, there are references that the mummies in Egypt, Egyptian tombs dating 2000 BC, and they were found to be wrapped in finest quality Indian muslin. The textile was manufactured all over the country. I mean, in fact, it appears that the whole country was busy in spinning, weaving, dyeing, printing cotton clothes and all that. Why did it happen? I mean, this is another question that since this topic is never raised. Indian weavers did lots of innovations. They could produce high quality fabric with an exclusive design. That's true even today. They invented natural and bright dye stuffs. The variety of fabric that we have in India. I was searching into the history of Indian cotton trade. I was surprised to read that muslin from Dhaka was of 4 types: Malmal, Daria, Charkhana, and Jamdani. There were 17 types of Malmal, 10 types of Daria, and 10 types of Jamdani. See the kind of variety this country could produce, one region of this country could produce. Then I was interested in looking into the records of imperial gazetteers. Everyone should read that, volume 3. What it says is that there are 300 fiber yielding plants in India. Of this, about 100 are more or less regularly used by people. And about 10 to 12 were established for the articles of trade. Now I started counting, do I know these 10 to 12 varieties of fibers which our ancestors, why ancestors, our people, 150 years used to make use for the articles of trade? We can't. How much have we lost during this period? This all needs to be brought up to the, and there is largely a sweeping statement which is made that Indians lost that science and technology, whatever they had, because there was the invention of steam, and steam powered factories could produce things better and faster. It is not true. The Indian textile export is an example of that. We know that the whole cotton the textile industry was killed by British by two measures. One was the Calico Act of 1721, which banned the import of most of the cotton textiles in England. And back in India, the Indian manufacturers were made to pay disproportionately high local taxes. The cotton manufacture of England and imported to India attracted duty of 2.5%, while the cotton goods of India consumed in India were levied 17.5%. This is that protectionism. The same protectionism killed the iron technology in this country. The same protectionism killed the textile technology in this country. The sum total of this is that India was rich because of the innovations, the skills, and entrepreneurship. Every household was a place where something was manufactured. India was the workshop of the world. This has to be taken to our younger generation. When we talk about entrepreneurship, this is nothing new to this country. And through this, the innovation, skills, and entrepreneurship, we can regain that title, which we have merrily gifted to China, the workshop of the world. This has to be communicated to the country. If you give me just a minute, I must also tell you that apart from sciences, there is a lot of Indian wisdom in many other places, in many other fields. For example, education, trade, commerce, we are not aware of. When I was giving some talks on education, I used to recite this verse. What is India's ancient wisdom? How do we learn? See, this learning is important, and that is what also the national education policy talks about. It is not the teaching, but it is the learning. And what this verse says, Acharyat padamadatte padam shishya sumayhridaya sad brahmacharibhya padam kala kramena. Padam is 1/4. So you get 1/4 from the teacher, 1/4 from your own intelligence, swamedhaya, 1/4 from peers, sad brahmacharibhya padam. You get 1/4 by discussion with your fellow colleagues, and 1/4 kala kramena cha, that is by the practice. Now, this is the very important thought, that it is teacher who is not solely responsible for it. It is 1/4 from the teacher, 1/4 from the intelligence, 1/4 from the discussion with your fellow colleagues, and 1/4 with the practice. The role of a teacher is to help the student in all these 4 compartments. See, these are lots of interesting thoughts, important thoughts, and therefore this committee, what we are doing is collating all the thoughts across the fields, not only in sciences, but also in education, trade, commerce. There's an important question you can ask. When Indians were seafaring people, did they know how to draw maps? See, these are the questions we can ask, and then we can search for the answers. So it's a very interesting area, and I hope we'll succeed in due course of time. Thank you very much for asking that question. What we can do with the modern science? Yes, we have some traditional science, the arts, the technical arts, or the skills. What we need to do is you need to have some interception by modern science and technology. That will enhance the efficacies of those skills or the knowledge. How do we do that? Now, I had a colleague in PRC, or Dr. Indira Priyadarshini, and she was working on all kinds of Indian medicinal plants. And one example I'll give you is she was working on curcumin, and this curcumin, she used the modern techniques. And she used to tell me that, look, on curcumin, there is a lot of research going on across the world, in the United States, in England, in Europe, and it is being tried for a variety of diseases like pancreatic cancer, melanoma, colon cancer, Alzheimer's disease, all kinds of diseases people are trying this. Whereas in India, we don't do this. Being the director, I said, look, hey, this is very interesting. We should do this. And she came up with lots of formulations. Now, just to give you an answer, that the curcumin is used in every Indian food. And therefore, one would say that why do we need to use curcumin as a medicine or nutraceutical? The answer lies in this, that the active ingredient there, the curcumin, is insoluble in water, and therefore its bioavailability is very low. And therefore you don't know how much haldi you should eat every day. So what she did was she introduced something by which that curcumin became bioavailable. And now she created a nutraceutical, and that nutraceutical, that technology has been transferred to some private firms for mass production. And it is claimed that if you take 1 spoon of that nutraceutical, it will give you 200 milligrams of bioavailable curcumin. And since curcumin is anti-cancer, chemopreventive, it's also anti-angiogenic. It also works against the gallstone formation. It is anti-arthritic, anti-diabetic. So just one formulation where the curcumin is made bioavailable, it has worked. She has also worked on many other medicinal plants. So it is possible to introduce modern science, modern technologies into our traditional knowledge and make them better in terms of the efficacies. So yes, indeed, that should be done.
Thank you. I mean, the first half of the answer, where you clearly touched upon the reasons why we kind of put to the backstage, despite having the past glory, is purely because of the protectionism that the colonial masters had levied in terms of barbaric taxation, if I may use the phrase. And there's a small tidbit that I wish to add here. And this is by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, in whose brainchild university where I'm currently sitting. He was the member of the Industrial Commission, whose report was tabled in 1960. And he had written a separate note, which later came to be known as a note of dissent. Basically, where he tried to show what we briefly discussed here, how because of British protectionism, they raised down 3 prominent industries: the iron and steel, the textile, and the shipbuilding. Of which you nicely summarized them. Let me just take 30 seconds and quote what Mahamana writes in that note of dissent, where he in turn quotes one colonial officer by name Mr. Taylor. And I quote, "The arrival in the port of London of Indian produce in India-built ships created a sensation among the monopolists which could not have been exceeded if a hostile fleet had appeared in the Thames. The shipbuilders of the port of London took the lead in raising the cry of alarm they declared that their business was on the point of ruin and that the families of all shipwrights in England were certain to be reduced to starvation, unquote. So this clearly demonstrates the might and the respect that our industry, in this particular case, the shipbuilding industry, wielded, to which the England counterparts were almost brought to their knees. And to prevent that from happening, the protectionism exhibited by them put us in a very backstage, and we are paying the price for it even now. Having discussed all this, the final question, because we are running short of time also, from there are other things which we could talk about, how the introduction of the alizarin dye in the late 1890s by the German chemists brought down our indigenous dye industry. Again,
Yes.
we are paying the brunt of it even to this day. It's very much known. Moving ahead, my final question to you would be that do you have any suggestions to the government or the researchers in general towards ancient and medieval Indian chemistry as to why such a venture is important and where it may lead us to in the future?
Yes, I have been airing my views on this particular issue. Also, I got now the committee with me. So the first one we have already talked about. That is, can we have scientific interventions in the traditional knowledge? And when I say it, I don't mean doing anything very, very great that we need to do, but I'll give you a very simple example, which I have been now, I have started showing it to the universities and colleges. Just look at the traditional pottery in South India, South Korea and India. Just start comparing. The person, the potter from South Korea and a potter from India. Our potter is with the tattered clothes and all that. Whereas the South Korean potter is well dressed. The second important thing that you need to also see is that what is the technology these potters are using? My Indian potter is using that wheel. He puts the sticks and rotates it, and then he makes the pots. It's a 2,000-year-old technology. Whereas the potter in South Korea has got an electricity operated wheel with the variable speeds. He can do a job better. Could we not even give such a smart technology to our potter where his efficiency can be enhanced? So when we say that these scientific interventions have to happen in the traditional knowledge, it has to happen across the board. It's not only making curcumin bioavailable, that may be at the higher end, but at lower end, we have so many opportunities by which there is the people working with ceramic. Can we empower them with science and technology interventions? That's one important issue. The second important issue is preservation and development of skills based on the tradition. See, there is no point in lamenting that during the British period, we lost the skill. But whatever are left with us, can we preserve them and develop them further? At the same time, can we reconstruct the lost skills, like the Malmal of Bengal or the wood steel of South India? Can we reconstruct? I think this would be areas which, and there are several other. I was advising Maharashtra government for the university education, and that time I made a strong case for all this. And the statistics which I gave to Maharashtra government was like this. All these traditional skills, whatsoever we may say, they constitute the unorganized sector of the Indian economy. And 20% of the manufacturing in India is going on in the unorganized sector. And this unorganized sector employs 80% of the workforce. And this unorganized sector has no access to science and technology. If we can provide those science and technology inputs to this sector and increase their efficiency, let's say their productivity by merely 25%, the entire GDP of this country will increase by 1%. I have given the whole statistic. 1% growth in the GDP is no mean. But this can happen only if we can empower. This is one issue. Second issue is that the unorganized sector can be transferred into the organized sector through education. This is a very important step that the governments can take. And for that, this traditional knowledge, traditional skills in particular, have to become part of our education. They must be taught. See, for example, in Maharashtra, I used to give an example that I got such a beautiful weaving industry, cottage industry in Paithani sari. But do you have any scheme for skill development there? There is no way the skill development takes place. I said, make it part of your diploma course of your university. Let the person learn that. Let him get a diploma. He also feels that he's empowered by education and he can take it forward. If you don't give him education, the advantage of education, he's going to be like that potter of India with the tattered clothes and with mud on his clothes. Look, that's not the style that the new generation would like. You can give credibility and respectability by including them in the university education. And this has got tremendous possibilities of local entrepreneurship and startups and all that. Remember one thing, I also feel that this country requires artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is not to say that these are not required. These are required. However, we need to also understand that AI and ML are going to reduce the jobs. Already there is a prediction that about 60% jobs in the country will be lost. So in that scenario, we need to look at newer avenues of employment. And where are those newer avenues of employment? Can we take recourse to our traditional knowledge, traditional skills, and create those avenues? So that's the broader perspective which I have been talking to the universities and also to the government. Let's see how much. And another important thing that we also must note that the intellectual property rights of the traditional knowledge have to be protected. See, I talked to you about the curcumin. You know the story of Ashwagandha. The Ashwagandha you can use in the raw form, but today you probably cannot do it, cannot extract the active ingredient and do some studies because it has been patented in Japan. See, we have knowledge, but we don't have that value for it. I'll also tell you at the end something very, very important. When I visit universities, which are particularly in the interiors, they get requests from European American universities so that they can study the living of the Aborigines origins living in that place. So the university has to give the accommodation, and the university, our universities are extremely happy. We're getting foreign scientists to study our Aborigines. Yeah. Now you see, once I visited a university and asked them, you know, what are they going to do? They are going to study the medicinal plants, what those people use. They are going to look at all such knowledge which these Aborigines have generated over Adivasis have generated over centuries and thousands of years. Why don't you go and study this? Why do you require these professors from European or American universities to do that? This is exactly what has happened in the Ashwagandha. Some university faculty must have, for some foreign trip, wrote a collaborative project with a Japanese scientist. And finally, it was patented. So protecting the intellectual property rights of our traditional knowledge is extremely important.
Thank you, Professor Jagtap. And that was a real nice interaction that we have had, where it's like, as I said before, and as you have also time and again reinforced, that we are now in a stage where we are looking back and trying to see what are the past glories, with the hope and with enough apparatus, ammunitions, intellectual as well as physical, that we will be able to not only consolidate the past information, but also present them to our next generation in a more authenticated way, and with a hope that this knowledge will further bloom into newer technologies. So with that, on my personal behalf and on behalf of the Atharva Forum, I thank you immensely for your time and the words of wisdom that you have shared with us on this platform. I also thank our viewers for their patient listening, and I request them to subscribe to the Atharva Forum YouTube channel and click on the bell icon for notification on new videos. Namaste.
Thank you very much.